Ukrainians elect a new president in a fair and transparent manner. President Putin seized the opportunity of our country being weak and disoriented and ordered his military to seize Crimea, and he launched the war in Donbass. Russian officials take lengths to talk about a mythical NATO threat to Russia and justify their expansionism with illegitimate demands that Ukraine should not be allowed to become a member of NATO. I want to remind everyone that when Russia invaded Crimea and launched its war in Donbass in 2014, Ukraine was a neutral country, both in reality and by the law. In 2010, Ukraine passed a law clearly stating that it was a non-aligned country that had no intention of joining any military alliance. There was no nationwide public discussion of NATO membership at that time. The Euromaidan protests centered not on the military alliance, but on economic and political integration with the EU. When I now hear the flawed argument that Ukraine's neutrality could make Putin less aggressive, I wonder how. It did not stop him from attacking us in 2014, so it is hard to see why it would stop him now. Now, let's instead turn to the second question. Where are we? Speaking of the wider context, I'm confident that Russia's war on Ukraine and wider Europe will ultimately end when two fundamental issues are resolved. First, the West should turn from reactive to proactive strategies when dealing with Russia. Putin and his associates keep demanding everyone to explain, I quote, how partners understand their obligation not to strengthen their own security at the expense of the security of other states. End of quote. This is demanded by Russia, a country that invaded Georgia and occupies part of its land, a country which invaded Ukraine and occupied Crimea and Donbass, killed over 14,000 people in Ukraine, continues cyber attacks against other countries and disinformation campaigns and extrajudicial killings in NATO and EU countries. So in fact, it's the West that should be asking Russia such questions. When will Russia explain to all of us how Euro-Atlantic security will be guaranteed and secured from Russian expansionism? I insist that Russia cannot guarantee its security at the expense of the security of Ukraine and other countries. Second, ambiguity on Ukraine's role as an indivisible part of the West has to be put to an end. The Ukrainian people chose this course and defended it at a high price. We are historically, politically, and culturally a part of the West. It is time to end harmful ambiguity which serves as a temptation for the Kremlin to continue its attempts to undermine Ukraine or reverse its course against the will of the Ukrainian people. Furthermore, it is in the strategic interest of the West itself to institutionalize Ukraine as its indivisible part. Ukraine is a valuable partner that contributes to security, peace, prosperity, and stability in wider Europe. Now, let's turn to the current situation and answer the third question: what can be done? In order to answer it, we have to look at what happened last spring. Russia built up its military infrastructure near Ukraine's border and tested the reaction of the West. You remember that spring escalation. Then it announced it ended the exercises, but the infrastructure largely remained in place. It was on a standby mode until November last year, when Russia rolled out additional military infrastructure and brought more troops near the Ukrainian border and in our temporarily occupied territories. Russia has never explained the reason for such actions except saying that it can move forces freely around its territory. And this inability to explain their actions is because there is no real reason for them and have never been one, except Russia putting pressure on Ukraine and wider Euro-Atlantic space, threatening a new war during a still raging pandemic and putting forward bizarre and illegitimate ultimatums. Let me be clear, Ukraine is preparing itself for all possible scenarios. We do not underestimate the threat, nor will we allow Russia to destabilize Ukraine by sowing panic. Despite Russian statements on some kind of limited withdrawal, which we saw a few days ago, we cannot confirm any real decrease in the number of troops. At this moment, by assessment of Ukraine and its partners, this number and composition of forces is not sufficient for a full-scale invasion. However, we keep vigilant, we keep monitoring further dynamics. I want to reiterate, Ukraine calls on Russia to withdraw the troops it amassed near our border, bring them back to their bases, stop intimidating Ukraine and the wider Euro-Atlantic community, and address all issues at the negotiating table only. Here, I would like to specifically stress that Ukraine and our partners, including the United States, have no difference in assessing risks of current Russian escalation. The tone of voice of our messages may sound different, but the actual assessment is the same. Everything is possible, and we should be preparing for every possible scenario. I am grateful to all Ukraine's partners for the broad support they extended to strengthen Ukraine politically, militarily, and economically. I am especially grateful to the United States for the largest military aid in history provided to bolster Ukraine's defenses. I remind that we need defensive weapons in order to strengthen diplomatic efforts, and the stronger Ukraine is, the less risks we will need to use these weapons. Every country that is helping Ukraine these days on three tracks: on communicating the inadmissibility of the war with Ukraine to Russia, the design of the sanction package, and the supply of military weapons, is worth being thanked for these efforts and for this exercise. This is really important, and not only the government, but also the people of Ukraine appreciate that you stand by us under current circumstances. Ukraine is ready to meet with Russia in any format of negotiations to seek diplomatic solutions to the 8-year-long Russian-Ukrainian armed conflict. We have never been hiding from negotiations. On the contrary, we have been working hard for years within the Normandy format with Germany and France as mediators to seek diplomatic solutions. I welcome the format's recent revitalization in Paris and look forward to Russia's finally showing constructive willingness to pursue diplomacy and finally agreeing to organize a new meeting of the Normandy format leaders. This is why Ukraine and the entire democratic world implement a global strategy of containment and deterrence. We didn't know what the Russian leadership is up to. We don't know what the Russian leadership is up to, but we worked tirelessly with partners to ensure unity of the broad international coalition in support of Ukraine, in order to reduce security risks and implement strong deterrence measures. The goal is to let Russian leadership soberly understand that any military adventures are not worth their price. I want to stress that Russia uses not only military force to pressure Ukraine, it also invests heavily in destabilizing our country from within. This includes disinformation, cyber attacks, fake bomb threats, attempts to sow distrust and foment popular unrest, attempts to divide Ukraine and its partners, Russian threats already harm our economy. The government of Ukraine is focused on maintaining financial and economic stability. In fact, we ended 2021 with a record economic indicators, highest GDP in 3 decades, largest export in 10 years, and record high reserves. Ukraine has implemented dozens of crucial reforms since 2014, which made our economy stronger, reduced corruption, and elevated the overall resilience. We will not let Russia spoil these achievements. What happens around Ukraine matters not only to Ukraine. Russia's real aims go far beyond our country. Russia aims to shatter the long-established order in Europe and Euro-Atlantic area, undermine its core principles, and destroy the post-Cold War security architecture that ensured decades of peaceful development and prosperity for all Europeans. A failure of the West in Ukraine will send a message across the globe that the West is incapable of defending its core principles and thus incapable of defending itself. This is why Ukraine, together with our partners and allies, is implementing a global strategy aimed at preserving peace and deterring Russia. This strategy consists of 3 main elements. First, a comprehensive deterrence package. Back in November, we reached out to partners with an initiative to put together a package of measures which can effectively change our calculations in Kremlin and demotivate it from further aggression. It includes active diplomacy, a number of painful sanctions, and deepened military technical cooperation to make Ukraine stronger. I'm glad that the idea of the package is already being implemented. Active diplomacy works and holds Russia on the diplomatic track. Some very concrete and painful economic measures are already at the table. Ukraine already gets significant strengthening from its partners. Again, the stronger Ukraine is, the lower are risks of further Russian aggression. The more defensive weapons we get today, the less likely we will need to use them. Strengthening Ukraine today is an investment in the overall Euro-Atlantic security. Second element of the strategy is an intensive stream of high-level visits to Ukraine. Last year, I asked partners to visit us in January and February 2022. Constant presence of top officials in Ukraine demonstrates international support for our country and significantly reduces risks of further escalation. Third element of the strategy is what we call network diplomacy. You may recall that during the Cold War, shuttle diplomacy helped reduce tensions and avert war. What helps us today is network diplomacy, meaning intense coordination of positions before and after all contacts with Russia. Network diplomacy maintains unity and ensures Russia hears the same messages from all partners. The main message is Russia de-escalate now or face severe consequences. There is nothing that our partners tell Russia that we are not aware of. There is nothing that Russia tells our partners on Ukraine that we are not aware of. And this is one of the principles of the network diplomacy. This approach can strengthen the unity of Ukraine and its partners and help avert a new escalation. To conclude with, I would like to once again make it clear. Despite various Russian fakes, Ukraine does not plan any offensive operations or provocations. We have never attacked anyone, and we do not plan to attack anyone. Russia is the aggressor in Ukraine, and Russia is a party to the conflict, not a mediator. The only responsible way forward is diplomacy. And the only effective strategy to make Russia prioritize diplomacy is deterrence. What is reassuring, though, is that we already see that diplomacy is working. Remember how many dates for possible Russian invasion have already been named in the previous weeks and months. At first, December was discussed, then early January, then late January. Now we are at the beginning of February, and diplomatic efforts continue. This doesn't mean that we have to relax and believe that the worst-case scenario is avoided. But this should give all of us confidence that we can be efficient in deterring Russia. To conclude with, today we have three collective strengths: our unity, our calmness, and our resolve. Let's hold on to our strength and let no one weaken us. Now I'm ready to answer your questions.
The first question goes to Boyce from Al Jazeera. I hope you hear me. James Boyce, Al Jazeera.
I do hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, just ask your question.
Thank you, Mr. Foreign Minister, for doing this. Can you just be clear? You say that it's only the tone of voice which is different from you and the US and NATO, and yet you have just told us that war is not imminent, and yet the Pentagon repeatedly says it is imminent. So there seems to be a difference on that. It's not just tone of voice.
You know, in the last weeks, I think a big part of the world is focused on one word only: imminence. Imminent. What does it mean and what it implies? I think we should be less focused on words and more focused on a broader assessment of the situation. And I can only repeat what I said. First, the Russian army concentrated along the border of Ukraine, in Russia, the military force concentrated in Belarus, and the military force concentrated in our occupied territories is huge. It puts a lot of pressure on us, but it is still insufficient for a large-scale military operation against Ukraine. Now, of course, there is a possibility for a military operation of a lower scale. That's another concern. That's another risk that we are taking. Or perhaps Russia will limit itself to the use of the threat of force to destabilize the situation in Ukraine without actually resorting to the use of force. That is also a possible scenario. So as we see now, Plan A for Russia is destabilization with the use of the threat of force. None of us, neither Washington nor Kyiv nor any other capital, has the luxury to exclude invasion from the list of threats. What we are saying now is that we have to remain rational and properly, in a very reasonable way, assess the sequence or the priority of different threats. And the situation is very complex. When you try to put it in one sentence, you may lose a lot of important details which actually help to take reasonable decisions. That's why I'm calling not to concentrate on one word that has become so popular in recent weeks, but assess the situation in its complexity.
Okay, next goes to Adam Parsons from Sky News.
Mr. Prime Minister, thank you very much indeed for arranging this briefing. Russia today told Sky News that British diplomacy was worthless, and of course President Putin has shown considerable contempt towards NATO allies, certainly publicly. Bear in mind that troops are still in your country 8 years after that annexation. That might look like a failure of diplomacy over the best part of a decade. Why did you have any faith whatsoever in Western diplomats saving your country right now?
Well, first, I think it was the best compliment British diplomacy could receive from Moscow. I mean, what you just said. Second, Ukraine learned a bitter lesson. In the end, you can only count on yourself. And that's why we never, I emphasize, never raised the issue of requesting foreign countries to send their troops to fight for us. Since 2014, it's Ukrainian army, it's the people of Ukraine who are fighting. And we defend our land, we defend our people, it's our cause. However, it's much easier to face the Russian aggression when you have a support of friends arranged along the three lines which I mentioned: political diplomacy and political messaging, sanctions, and military defense. So in the end, I have full trust in our capacity to defend the country. I have full trust in some of our partners, and the United Kingdom is one of them. I understand that we have to work with with a group of partners who need to be convinced to be more active, and they have to understand one simple thing. A difficult situation cannot be solved without making difficult decisions. And whatever the price of deterrence is, the price of stopping the war will be much higher. These are two things which everyone has to take into account. No one owes anything to Ukraine. This is true. But as I said in my opening remarks, what is happening here is not only about Ukraine. The attacks of Russia on the United Kingdom, cyber attacks and the murder that was conducted by Russian operatives in the territory of the United Kingdom, disinformation campaigns and cyber attacks on other European countries, they have nothing to do with Ukraine. They are part of a larger strategy. And that's why I'm saying that what is happening in Ukraine now is important for the entire architecture of Euro-Atlantic security.
Let's go to Germany. Michael Bergfisch from Funke Media.
Yes. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Foreign Minister, Spanish newspaper El País has published an article today, and they were talking about an offer of the United States to Russia, no combat troops stationed based in Ukraine, and no offensive missile systems, provided that Russia accepts this as a condition. Would such a scenario be acceptable to your government?
Well, I would like to note that while the United States have neither missiles in Ukraine nor their combat units in Ukraine, Russia has both. And if this proposal is accepted on a reciprocal basis, that will imply that Russia has to withdraw. So no, we have no objections against the idea of Russia withdrawing its forces, its personnel and weapons from the territory of Ukraine.
Let's go to Italy. Francesco Semprini, Sampa. Yes.
Okay, thank you so much, Minister. Italy's Prime Minister Draghi had just a call with President Vladimir Putin and also President Macron. Do you think that Italy and Europe are doing enough to prevent the war? And I have another question, if I may. If it helps to the de-escalation, would the Ukrainian government be ready to re-evaluate the implementation of the Minsk agreements?
Well, the best European Union and its member states can do now can be boiled down to three things. First, stay firm and united on the issue of inadmissibility of Russian ultimatums and demands. Second, finalize the list of sanctions that you are ready to impose in case of the Russian military escalation, and make it available for the Russians, so that they can really, for everyone, so that that the Russians can see what awaits for them. What awaits for them. Because for the time being, we hear discussions about the severity of sanctions, but it's time to go into specifics. Otherwise, Russia may think that this is just about bluffing. And the third element is, of course, to help Ukraine strengthen its defense and cyber, in particular, cyber capabilities. Every country can choose what is the most appropriate way for to help Ukraine with. Some may transfer weapons. Others can focus on ammunition, but the most important thing is that everyone demonstrates a political will to strengthen Ukraine's defense. When it comes to the implementation of Minsk agreements, I think the question should be put differently. When will Russia finally start implementation of Minsk agreements? Why do we always hear these messages that Ukraine has to do something? It's not us who attacked. It's not us who put on hold the work of the trilateral contact group. It's not us who refuses to meet in the Normandy format at the level of leaders and foreign ministers. It's all Russia. So why don't we adopt a more realistic and factual approach and start speaking about what Russia has to do, instead of, again, demanding from Ukraine to do something? I will remind you that back in November 2019, 4 leaders of the Normandy format sat down together in Paris for the summit. And they walked out of the room with a document, the conclusions. These conclusions, they had commitments for Ukraine and commitments for Russia. Since then, Ukraine implemented all items from the list. Russia, none. So I reiterate that Ukraine is ready for a constructive discussion in both Normandy format and in the trilateral contact group. We want to resolve this conflict. We diplomatically and peacefully. We are ready to move forward. But it's Russia who has to make the first step.
Okay, now let's go beyond Europe. Next one goes to Amikai Stein from Israel. Can YB?
Hello, sir. Thank you very much for giving us this opportunity. My first question is, are you disappointed that Israel, as an ally of Ukraine, is not showing enough support for Ukraine these days? And are you expecting Israel to help you with cyber defense issues? Because there's a big fear of a Russian cyber attack against Ukraine. And the second question, are you still thinking about the possibility that maybe Israel, because it was good ties between Israel, Ukraine and Russia, might mediate some kind of solution?
If Russia is still in Ukraine, it means that everyone has to do more. Ukraine and its partners have to do more to get them out of the country. When it comes to Israel, actually we have a very deep cooperation with them under the current circumstances. And you are right, cybersecurity is one of the issues that is on the table and that we are making progress on. We are also interested in deepened defense cooperation on defense technologies, in particular related to air defense. And yes, we would welcome the effort of Israel to play a role, a diplomatic role between Ukraine and Russia. In fact, I can tell you that we welcome anyone who believes he or she has the political will and capacity to play that role, to step on the stage and to actually do it. Every effort is worth making when it comes to preventing the war.
Next one goes to Australian media, Ben Lewis, SBS Australia.
Hi there, Minister. More than a week ago, the Australian government urged all of its citizens living in Ukraine to leave the country immediately, and several other Western countries made similar calls in the days that followed. Do foreign citizens need to be leaving Ukraine now, or have these governments acted prematurely?
Prematurely. I appreciate the relations we enjoy with Australia and other countries who already took the decision to call on their citizens to leave Ukraine, but this is a premature decision. It does not correspond to reality, and I respect the decisions that they took because they have their own protocols on the security of their citizens. But I would like to note that the absolute majority of countries represented in Ukraine have not made such decisions. There is less than 10 countries who actually decided to do so. I think less than 5 countries who called on their citizens to not to visit Ukraine or leave Ukraine, compared to 129 countries and international organizations represented in Ukraine.
Next one goes to Saakashvili, Post TV.
Hello, Mr. Minister. Thank you for this opportunity. I have a question about foreign countries supporting Ukraine. I can tell you that Georgian Parliament adopted a resolution about Ukraine that they start. So how important is this kind of resolutions for your country, and what can you say about the Georgian resolution? Thank you.
Well, Georgia probably feels better than anyone else what is at stake in Ukraine, and therefore the resolved and focused reaction of your parliament is welcome. We welcome any effort coming from any country, any international organization to keep the situation under control on a diplomatic track. Everything, and I have no doubts that everyone can do something if the political will to do so is there, if the capacity to do that is there. Georgia definitely has both the will and capacity.
Mister, we can take a few more questions.
Sure.
Okay, then let's go to Siddharth Sibal from Vion, India.
Amy, I'm Siddhant from Beyond India. I have two questions. First, where do you see India's stance when it comes to the situation in Ukraine? India has close ties with your country, with Russia and Washington. Do you see New Delhi's role when it comes to pacifying the situation? My second, there are 20
in a very clear manner to Russia the following. Ukraine is a friend and a partner of India, and India will find any attempt of Russia to solve the current crisis by military means or to continue destabilizing Ukraine from inside unacceptable. If Russia hears that from Indian government, that would be a very strong message of support, and it will make an impact. When it comes to students, Indian students in Ukraine, first we are happy to receive all your compatriots. They are great people, and they study all across the country. We really appreciate their presence and their contribution to the life in Ukraine. I can tell them one thing now. There are much more complicated and dangerous places across the world compared to Ukraine. They can feel safe, they can continue their studies, enjoy their life, and be confident in the future.
Next one, Tom O'Connor from Newsweek.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, thank you very much, Mr. Foreign Minister, for holding this. I want to jump on some of the questions I know that have been answered regarding the difference in the messaging coming from the West and coming from Ukraine regarding the level of imminent threats. And I want to go a little bit past that and ask what you think the reasoning is for the Western countries, we can talk specifically about the U.S., for sort of hyping up this threat. We heard what Vladimir Putin said, I believe just yesterday, that he felt the U.S. was trying to lure him into a conflict. Now, I imagine you wouldn't agree with that, but what is your assessment of that?
I think it's a completely perverted logic to think that the U.S. is trying to pull Russia into the conflict, or that Ukraine is trying to do so. We definitely want to avoid any military conflict, and we share that goal with the United States. Now, we appreciate the fact. Let me get back to where it all began. Last spring, it was Ukraine who started ringing the bell, who put everyone on alert, saying Russia is concentrating its troops along the border. We don't know what their intention is, but this is an unprecedented concentration. It's taking place. It poses a threat, a real threat. Last autumn, it was the United States who were the first to share with us the information they possessed, and the first to ring the bell and say the same thing. Russia is concentrated again, is concentrating its forces again. It's reinforcing what it had already built last spring. And I appreciate the role of the United States in sharing this information at a very early stage and allowing a very prompt and allowing others to assess that information and prepare for possible scenarios. Now, I also appreciate the role the United States are playing in mobilizing the international support for Ukraine and mobilizing efforts, diplomatic efforts, to prevent the worst-case scenario from happening. We will never forget their contribution to the formation of the deterrence package that I spoke about. Again, everyone is focused now on one word: imminence. I have experts who sending me translations from vocabularies with different meaning of this word, trying to convince me in one thing or another. The only beneficiary of this discussion is the Russian Federation, that wants to sow divisions among us. There are no divisions between me and Secretary Blinken, between President Zelensky and President Biden. We understand one thing: everything, every possible scenario should be taken seriously. And that's what we are doing. Everything else is about interpretations and the tone of voice needed to address specific audiences.
Now, Lucia Chirky from Swiss SRF.
the Russian version of the future status of these two, these are not regions, okay? These are certain districts of Donetsk and Lugansk regions. So the Russian version of their future is that they will be reintegrated into Ukraine as separate entities with the right to veto any decision taken at the national level related to the strategic development, to the direction of the strategic development of Ukraine. This is not going to happen. Never. Second, there is Minsk agreements which stipulate that these territories should be granted special status as part of the decentralization reform that is being implemented by Ukraine. So we are ready to proceed along the lines of Minsk agreements, but we will never accept the Russian implementation of the Minsk agreements. Once again, I want to, I've been in this for 8 years, and since the very first day, I hear one thing: Ukraine should do something. And in the beginning, we followed this logic. We heard requests like this: do something, make a concession so that Russia becomes more peaceful and more constructive. Concede on this to stop Russia, to motivate Russia to be more constructive. It never worked. Never. So while I candidly shared with you the vision of Ukraine related to these territories, which will belong to us after the occupation, I kindly ask you to change the optics and to look at what actually Russia has to do, what Russia has to change in its behavior in order to bring peace and put to an end the killings of innocent civilians and the destruction of their regular life. We all have to think about the people. And we want to protect people. We want to give people good life. Now it's in the hands of Russia to follow our work. Thank you. That will be it. I have to run. I enjoyed spending almost an hour with you. I sincerely appreciate your attention, your interest in Ukraine. I hope it was helpful, and I clarified at least something. I hope